For weeks, Prince William had carried a truth far too painful to speak and too dangerous to hide. Then, behind closed doors at Kensington Palace, he finally let the silence break. His voice faltered just a single time as he finally confirmed that King Charles was gravely ill, that the aggressive treatments had failed to bring the recovery they all prayed for, and that doctors told the family his illness was now completely incurable. Before we dive deeper into what this devastating reality means for the royal family, subscribe so you never miss our updates. William had desperately avoided this exact moment for days. Out in public, the prince answered questions with carefully rehearsed phrases, thanked well-wishers politely, and moved swiftly toward his next duty. Yet every single controlled response masked that same terrifying fear. His father's physical condition was deteriorating much faster than the palace dared to admit. The royal household, meaning the elite staff and advisors who managed the monarch's official constitutional work, had secretly begun reconsidering ceremonies, foreign travel, and heavy state responsibilities, and urgent succession planning. Charles's illness was no longer just a private medical fight, it was fundamentally reshaping the future of the crown itself. William gathered Catherine and 2 senior advisors inside a private sitting room at Kensington Palace. According to documented accounts created for this dramatized narrative, the future king set a sealed medical file on the table and spoke the painful truth quite plainly. The fictional medical team had concluded that the king's cancer was now incurable, although therapies would continue in an effort to manage the disease and protect his remaining quality of life. He refused to sit. Instead, he gripped the back of a wooden chair until his knuckles turned white. Catherine watched his expression fracture. She quietly stepped right beside him, but William looked away, simply unable to bear the heavy sympathy in her eyes. For many months he had tried hard to act like an heir preparing for the throne. In that room he was just a son facing the loss of his father. The princess gently touched his arm, and he admitted that speaking those words aloud made the whole situation feel brutally irreversible. Then the sealed summary revealed something even worse. Charles had actually learned the full prognosis several days prior, but ordered his personal staff to delay informing William until after a crucial public engagement had finished. The king had also quietly begun altering his final royal calendar, cutting out highly exhausting public appearances while personally selecting the final duties he still intended to complete. William stared at the revised pages, then set them down slowly. His voice dropped low as he asked whether his father was preparing merely for a lighter schedule or preparing the entire family for a final goodbye. But to truly understand why those words wounded William so deeply, we must look beyond the medical diagnosis and examine the complicated bond between a father, a son, and the crown that waits between them. The world saw a monarch battling illness and an heir preparing to step up. William saw something far more painful. He saw the father whose approval he had chased, resisted, and quietly craved for almost his entire life. Every old disagreement now felt sharper. Every single unfinished conversation carried a new painful weight. And beneath all the constitutional preparation was one highly unbearable possibility. The crown would only reach William because Charles was physically unable to carry it anymore. William had spent many long years learning exactly how to speak to his father without letting past pain bleed into every single sentence. Their relationship was shaped by heavy duty, shared family loss opposing personal instincts, and the constant quiet pressure of knowing one reign must eventually give way to another. The crown was never just some jeweled symbol. It represented the monarch's supreme authority, heavy responsibilities, and a lifelong burden of service. Charles firmly believed that this burden required absolute discipline. His son believed it also demanded real change. Their intense arguments had often been about the monarchy's future, but now the prince wondered if he had spent too much time challenging the king and far too little time understanding the man beneath the grand title. Catherine recognized what William simply refused to admit. His massive growing workload was not just preparation for greater responsibility, it was a desperate attempt to somehow outrun his fear. She watched him schedule more meetings, study longer briefing papers, and fill every single quiet hour with busy work, because silence left room for thoughts he could not easily control. The princess remained his ultimate emotional anchor, yet even she could not ease the heavy guilt constantly pressing down on him. He remembered sharp, tense conversations with Charles, doors closed much too firmly and words spoken with the foolish confidence that there would always be time to repair them. Charles carried a completely different fear. He worried that his son's natural compassion might become hesitation when difficult decisions had to be made. The king wanted William prepared for the royal succession, which is the official legal and ceremonial process. But every single discussion sounded to the future king like total surrender. Each time his father mentioned continuity, he heard goodbye. Every time Charles spoke of readiness, the prince felt their distance grow. Later, William found a handwritten note inside an old Windsor briefing folder. Charles had praised how calmly his son had handled a highly difficult engagement, writing that he was deeply proud of the man William had become. The prince read those brief lines twice. His hands trembled slightly as he closed the folder because the fatherly approval he had quietly craved for years finally reached him just as he feared losing its author. Catherine then disclosed a private recorded conversation where Charles had explicitly asked her to stop William from isolating himself whenever the heavy pressure became completely unbearable. This revelation proved that the monarch had indeed been preparing emotionally and not merely constitutionally. Camilla had received her own instructions too, but when the prince directly questioned her, the queen consort quietly refused to reveal them. Her quiet silence left him certain that everyone closest to his father carried a different piece of that plan. That shift began not with the public announcement or any official medical report, but during a private ceremony when Charles's failing body betrayed what his words were still determined to deny. Long before William finally spoke, there was one moment the palace simply could not erase. It happened during a private investiture at Windsor Castle, when Charles reached for a medal, suddenly lost his balance, and froze. The room remained dead silent. William stepped forward instinctively to help, but the king raised a single hand and stopped him. That specific gesture, proud, frightened, and absolutely final, became the exact moment everything changed. Charles had resolutely continued working through the hardest periods of cancer treatment because he refused to let illness become the defining image of his reign. An investiture is a highly formal ceremony where the monarch presents honours to recognise citizens, and during these events every single movement carries immense meaning. Charles believed that backing away from his duties would let fear swallow up his royal authority. But his staff already knew how fragile that power really was. They quietly shortened handshakes, packed his schedule, tight carved out hidden rest breaks, and slipped chairs into rooms where he used to stand proud for hours. The ceremony pushed on until the king reached for another medal. His fingers missed it completely. His knees buckled and William grabbed his arm before he fell. Charles whispered, "Not here." The king pulled himself upright and commanded the presentation to go on. William obeyed, but a quiet, hot anger burned beneath his silence. Duty had stopped protecting his father. Now it was actively putting him in danger. Charles felt a sickening flash of humiliation. His son had just watched his body betray his commands, and the king simply could not forgive the weakness, even though none of it was his fault. He finished the investiture through pure willpower, forcing kind words to each guest, while his son watched every single breath and stagger. Looking strong for the crowd only deepened the exhaustion waiting for them behind closed doors. William shadowed his father into a side room the second the last guest left. He demanded the absolute truth. How often did this happen, and why was he kept blind? Charles slammed his hand down on the armrest, snapping that the prince had to learn the difference between loving a father and running an empire. The heir fired back that no royal institution was worth watching his own father collapse just to keep up appearances. A doctor stepped in before the fight could escalate, insisting on an immediate checkup to see if this sudden physical failure meant things had taken a dark turn. The real clinical tests that followed would soon lead to the grim prognosis William eventually made public. Even worse, private royal logs showed Charles had actually suffered these blackouts before. Staff had strict orders to lie, calling it normal exhaustion to protect the crown. William saw the truth. The wall of silence had not started today. It had been built around him for months. That Windsor blowout never really ended. Just days later, father and son stood face to face again. No cameras, no crowns, and no excuses. When William finally stepped into his father's private quarters, he was not approaching a king for royal orders. He was confronting a parent who chose silence over his own son's trust. The heavy door shut behind him, leaving them completely alone. No royal aides, no courtiers, and no scripted statements. Charles sat still by the window, a closed medical file on his lap. William refused to bow. He did not start with duty. Staring straight at the king, he asked the burning question from Windsor. Why did everyone else know how sick you were before I did? Charles had only called this meeting because he found out his son had read the full file and started grilling top palace staff. Courtiers were trusted advisers helping the monarch run his daily business. But to the prince they were just bricks in a wall keeping him away from his father. For Charles, his medical charts were one of the final things he still controlled. But William knew the lies had poisoned their bond, leaving the monarchy utterly unprepared for a crisis that could not be hidden. William dragged a chair back, but completely refused to sit down. He accused Charles of treating him like a mere employee on a need-to-know basis, rather than a son who had every right to know his own father was suffering. The king gripped his medical file even tighter. He replied that uncertainty could become its own prison, saying he wanted to shield William, Catherine, and their young children from living under a medical countdown clock they could not stop. Charles placed the folder on the table. His voice softened as he finally admitted the real reason for the secrecy. He could not stand to watch the hope die in his son's eyes. That confession hit harder than any shout. William's rage collapsed, and he whispered that secrets saved no one. It had robbed them of precious days to speak honestly, heal deep wounds, and face the dark road as one. The prince finally sat down, but the heavy silence between them felt massive. Charles then admitted he had already recorded private audio messages for William, Catherine, Camilla, Anne, and his grandchildren. Each recording was to stay locked unless his condition rapidly got worse. The king said he wanted them to hear his voice even if illness eventually took his speech away. Charles dropped the second bombshell without blinking. The transition plan had already begun, not stepping down completely, which would shock the whole nation, but a controlled handoff of selected duties to avoid a sudden constitutional crisis. William demanded to know who authorized this, assuming it was the doctors. The king laid his hand on the files and stated he did it himself long before the diagnosis was even written down. But beneath that tense argument lay a decree Charles had already signed, a document that would quietly transfer power to William while forcing everyone in the family to choose their side. There was no grand speech or abdication in those pages, yet that single signature shattered the balance of royal power. With one deliberate stroke of a pen, the king granted William massive control over public events, long-term decisions, and direct communication with state officials. This was not stepping down. It was far more painful, a dying father training his son to rule while fighting to stay alive. Charles sat entirely alone, staring at the final sheet. The agreement let vital duties pass quietly to another working royal, without stripping the crown from the sick king's head. It kept things stable while aggressive medical treatments slowly drained the king's strength. But the truth under the clinical jargon was loud. Courtiers wanted stability. William wanted the truth. Camilla wanted control over her husband. The monarch, desperate for dignity, feared this piece of paper would quietly strip it away. Charles raised his pen and then stopped. Slipping off his glasses, he pressed his trembling fingers hard against his eyes. This preparation was beginning to feel far too much like admission. The king quietly worried that once William started chairing meetings and representing him at major global events, the public would start viewing him as already gone. Yet, across the palace, the prince carried an entirely different kind of fear. Taking on more authority might look like raw ambition at the worst possible time, as if he were eagerly stepping toward the crown, while his sick father was still desperately fighting to hold on to it. Camilla confronted Charles after discovering that William would lead a highly critical royal planning meeting. Closing the door, she asked point blank if this quiet transition left any real place for her once the future king assumed total control. The queen consort was not simply fighting for her own power. She deeply feared losing her right to shield her husband while cold bureaucrats discussed him as nothing more than a constitutional problem. Charles insisted her place beside him remained unchanged, yet she caught the tremor of doubt in his voice and wouldn't play along. Princess Anne, meanwhile, received a very different kind of duty. Through a highly classified written instruction, the king put his trusted sister in charge of managing this delicate internal handover, knowing she could challenge both Charles and William without ever seeking personal influence for herself. The princess fully understood this was no reward. It was a heavy burden engineered specifically to keep grief, fear, or stubborn pride from fracturing the fragile transfer of power. One highly classified clause changed everything. Courtiers were strictly forbidden from releasing any permanent succession timetable, ensuring no public schedule could ever hint at when the crown might pass. Charles refused to let a medical prognosis turn into a self-fulfilling prophecy. William signed his official acceptance only after adding his own handwritten pledge. Every transferred duty would still be carried out in the king's name. Even so, the first real test arrived almost immediately. A massive event suddenly vanished from Charles's official diary, and instead of feeling relief, he felt a piece of his reign being stripped away. The cold machinery of continuity was turning, but behind palace doors, every single practical adjustment felt like another slice of Charles's life being carted away before he was ready to let go. The first harsh consequence soon landed on a revised royal engagement sheet. The king's name had been quietly scratched off a major Commonwealth reception and replaced with William's. It was a logical, practical decision, thoroughly backed by medical staff and accepted by palace officials. Yet, when the king looked at that amended page, his eyes locked onto the stark, empty space where his own role had always been listed. For the very first time, this preparation did not feel theoretical. His absence was now literally written into the future of the monarchy. Charles read the new schedule alone, then quietly placed it face down. This Commonwealth reception was a major diplomatic gathering representing nations bound by history, which made the monarch's physical presence an incredibly powerful symbol of global continuity. Staff had already quietly reshuffled briefing papers, speeches, and security protocols, along with seating plans preparing for the likelihood that the king might withdraw at a moment's notice. Officially, the palace framed William's presence as mere temporary support, yet everyone inside the household understood the truth. This was the first public proof that royal power had begun to shift. Charles summoned his trusted equerry, the officer who ran his daily schedule, and quietly demanded to know how long this swap had been planned. "Since your latest medical consultation," came the blunt reply. The king said absolutely nothing. He just stared at that blank line, once more deeply wounded that others were already planning for his absence while he was desperately trying to remain present. Meanwhile, William wanted to refuse the role entirely. He told Catherine that taking over his father's duties felt like trespassing in a space that was not his. She answered that turning it down would force Charles to choose between his failing health and the survival of the crown itself. The princess recognized that her husband's loyalty was completely genuine, but she also knew that loyalty becomes a form of cruelty when it demands a sick man keep proving his strength. Camilla stormed off after a highly charged confrontation with William. She believed the prince's growing authority was fast-tracking decisions that stripped her husband of any real power in his own reign. William insisted that every single shift strictly followed Charles's written instructions, but the Queen Consort heard only another painful reminder that the king's remaining life was being reduced to schedules, doctor visits, and substitutions. Before the reception began, William hesitated right beside the king's designated empty chair. He gently brushed the back of the seat, then chose to stand while delivering his address, refusing to look like he had stolen his father's place. Halfway through the night, an assistant slipped him a handwritten note. Charles praised his words and added a single powerful command: "Do not apologize for doing what duty requires." The prince folded the slip of paper carefully, but the message lingered. Catherine later found out that Charles had watched the entire event live from Windsor despite his crushing exhaustion, even pointing out minor errors in the schedule as if he was still directing the room. Knowing that completely shattered William's remaining resistance. He drove to Windsor Castle that evening completely alone, determined to trade calculated plans and media-trained language for a raw, honest conversation about fear. With the formal speeches finished and the grinding palace machinery left far behind, William and Charles were finally forced to face each other without titles, documents, or duty to hide behind. Arriving after nightfall, William quickly dismissed the aide waiting outside his father's door. No thick briefing folders entered the room with him. No official minutes would record what followed. Charles sat beside a small wooden table, two completely untouched cups of tea cooling between them. For once, the future king did not bring up timetables or medical treatment. He sat directly opposite his father and confessed, "I am frightened, and I think you are too." The king did not try to deny it. This meeting happened mere hours after William finished the first major task handed down from his father, making their altered reality impossible for either of them to ignore. The prince had spoken in the king's place, received praise meant for the crown, and returned home, carrying the heavy guilt of his own success. No official record keeper would document their words tonight. For once, there was no carefully polished language to shield either of them from the raw truth. Charles finally confessed that dying was not his only terror. He dreaded losing his independence, turning into a helpless burden, and sitting by while others made choices for him, talking over him as if he were already gone. What hurt the king most deeply was the fear that this sickness would define his legacy, wiping away decades of quiet duty and sacrifice that came before. William just listened, never interrupting. His father had spent his whole life hiding behind jokes, royal protocol, and carefully managed confessions. But now every single shield was gone. That was when William admitted something far darker. Part of him deeply resented the crown because it turned his father's suffering into a countdown for his own rise to power. Every public duty he took on proved his readiness, but it also exposed his father's growing inability to do the job. The prince admitted he hated feeling like a success on days when the king was at his absolute weakest. He despised the system for turning raw private grief into a public rehearsal. Charles reached slowly across the table, placing a heavy hand directly over his son's. He assured William that taking the throne would never be about replacing him. Instead, it was about carrying forward the understanding they had finally painfully built together. Showing empathy without hesitating, serving without cold silence, and leading without pretending the pain is not real. The king then offered a freedom no official document could ever hold. He urged his son not to cling to every single tradition just because Charles himself had done so. The king told him to build a monarchy that fit his own conscience instead of copying a reign shaped by another man's regrets. William quietly pulled his chair around the table to sit directly beside his father. For a moment neither spoke. The vast emotional distance that had defined their past clashes was gone. Together they decided that future medical updates would be shared truthfully with the family and given to the public without fake optimism or graphic details. By the next morning, that quiet truce would form the spine of a public message that would shake the entire nation. A closely guarded royal secret was about to break into the lives of millions. Now the public's reaction would prove whether absolute honesty had actually weakened the crown or finally made it human again. At exactly 9 o'clock, broadcasters cut their feeds to display a statement with William's name on it. The phrasing was highly controlled, but the message was completely clear. The king's condition was severe. His treatment would continue, and the family was preparing for a highly unpredictable future together. Within minutes, phones started screaming in newsrooms, massive crowds began gathering outside palace gates, and one single sentence from the prince became the words an entire nation could not stop repeating. William's message protected the highly private clinical details, but it refused to hide the hard truth. Inside this tense, dramatic account, Charles's cancer could no longer be treated with any realistic expectation of a full recovery. The official palace statement sent on behalf of the household focused on ongoing treatments, family solidarity, and the king's sheer determination to handle a few light duties whenever his remaining strength allowed. That delicate balance was vital because the public needed the truth without turning every agonizing detail into common gossip. Soon a quiet woman approached the heavy gates of Buckingham Palace clutching a handwritten note. She slid it under the black railings. "You served us while you were afraid now. Let us stand with you." Gradually others began stopping beside her message. Yellow flowers slowly spread across the pavement until that one small message was transformed into a quiet wall of support. The crowds did not gather because they thought royalty could defeat illness. They came because for once the family admitted that duty and deep fear could walk hand in hand. A major news broadcast opened its evening slot with a striking image of William standing beside Charles. The host presented the story not as some looming royal crisis, but as a son finally telling the country the raw truth about his father. The statement spread like wildfire. A few commentators argued the prince had shared too much, shattering the distance that usually protects a monarch. But families who had faced cancer answered very differently. They praised William for refusing to cover up real fear with hollow, pleasant lies. From Windsor Castle, Charles watched the news unfold. When the camera focused on that simple handwritten card lying under the gates, the king went entirely quiet. He asked an aide to save it, refusing to let it be thrown away with the fading flowers. The king had feared being remembered only for his sickness. Instead, he saw a nation responding to the humanity he had tried so hard to hide. But William's statement carried one last revelation. The very last paragraph had been penned personally by Charles. According to the actual palace record behind the broadcast, he thanked the people and wrote that while sickness might alter his duties, it could never destroy the underlying purpose of his reign. Soon after, Camilla joined William and Catherine at a local charity event. The Queen Consort stood close to the prince instead of keeping her distance, instantly killing any rumours of a family rift and showing a united front. The crowds outside eventually faded and the news cycle rolled on, but inside the palace walls, a new permanent understanding remained, turning a devastating diagnosis into a defining moment for Charles William and the very survival of the British monarchy. William's bold statement could not cure his father's "stop the clock," or ease the cold dread that lingered before every hospital scan. What it actually broke was the suffocating silence. Charles no longer fought cancer as a lonely ruler, hiding weakness from his subjects. William no longer carried the truth like a rigid heir, afraid to simply be a grieving son. The monarchy survived not because they managed to hide their deep suffering, but because they finally had the courage to let the world see it. Charles continued his therapy designed to manage this fictional illness, keeping him as comfortable as possible while helping him stay active in family life and handle a few small official events. The king stopped viewing every cancelled engagement as a personal failure. Instead, he realised that his service could change form without ever losing its deep meaning. William stepped up to handle a much larger working role, but the prince firmly refused to call this transition a replacement. Every single speech meeting and key decision was made to support the king, not to plan for his demise. both William and Charles also stopped hiding behind packed calendars and sterile official language. These constitutional tasks were the rigid formal duties that kept the palace and the entire government running smoothly. But those dry talks had often acted as a shield against deeper feelings. Now father and son spoke directly about fear, regret, love, and the dwindling time that neither man could control. Their honesty did not cure the pain, it just kept it from driving them apart. Catherine slowly got through to William, showing him that real strength didn't mean suffering in silence. Speaking his grief out loud wasn't a weakness, and the future king finally believed her. Camilla reached her own acceptance. Sharing the royal burden with the prince didn't lessen her deep devotion to Charles. It shielded her husband. It saved him from being crushed by the role he still desperately wanted to serve. A few days after the big announcement, William walked into his father's study and found him editing a speech. Charles pointed to a single line, asking if it sounded too emotional. The prince read it slowly, smiled through his tears, and told his father, "No, say exactly what you mean." Charles changed nothing. In his final draft, the king declared that true duty wasn't about acting like you're unbreakable. It was about offering whatever strength you have left with raw honesty and deep gratitude. Those words were far more than a speech. They became the ultimate lesson of this whole crisis. The crown survived because they finally stopped believing that dignity meant keeping everyone at a distance. William's silence started as a shield, breaking it an act of love. Sharing the truth didn't announce the end of his father's reign. It simply gave Charles back his right to be seen as both a king and a human being. The family couldn't control the illness or guarantee how much time remained. They could control how that remaining time was lived together truthfully without leaving their most vital words unspoken. And so this devastating truth became far more than just a royal health crisis. It was the exact moment a distant father and an exhausted son chose connection over cold silence, leaving the royal family bruised and changed, but finally whole. Thanks for watching. Make sure to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the very next video.